Jerry Garcia, celebrated guitarist and vocalist for the Grateful Dead, dies just 8 days after his 53rd birthday.
He'd checked into rehab the night before he died.
Friends, family, and deadheads around the world mourn the loss of a man known best for his free-loving communal spirit and unforgettable live shows.
People would get really high and dance with great abandon while the Grateful Dead were on stage really high playing with great abandon.
I saw the Grateful Dead in concert 194 times, and that's not enough, but that's as many as I got to see.
But the feel-good vibe disappears when it comes time to divvy up Garcia's multi-million-dollar estate.
If Jerry were watching Beyond the Grave, he'd be laughing and laughing and laughing.
The more famous they got, the more beloved they were, the more they attracted opportunists.
August 9, 1995. Jerry Garcia, Grateful Dead frontman, dies of a fatal heart attack at Serenity Knolls Drug Rehabilitation Center. He is 53 years old.
Jerry's death was a national tragedy. His obit ran on the front page of the New York Times as the lead news story of that day.
Family, friends, fans, and deadheads are shaken by the news of Garcia's death.
When certain people die, it just makes you sad. Whether it's John Lennon, whether it's John F. Kennedy, whether it was Jerry Garcia, it's the end of an era.
In San Francisco, a tie-dyed flag is hoisted over City Hall to pay tribute to the man who epitomized 1960s counterculture, free love, peace, and of course, rock and roll. Garcia's name stood not only for his music, but for a way of life.
Well, Jerry Garcia was a great American musician and a cultural figure of tremendous prominence and value. He was a founder and leading light of the Grateful Dead, who were founders and leading lights of the San Francisco music scene, and a sort of cultural revolution that sprang up in the mid-'60s on the West Coast. And Jerry was one of its most articulate spokesmen and leaders. Although he constantly and permanently disavowed the role of leader, he was a leader just by nature.
Several days after the singer's passing, a public memorial takes place in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. With Garcia gone, deadheads around the world find themselves left with a gaping hole in their lives.
When Jerry died was the saddest day of my life, without a doubt. Following the Grateful Dead was not just a tour, it was an adventure. We loved meeting our friends, listening to the music, hanging out in the parking lot, hanging out after the shows, staying together. So it was a huge change in my lifestyle. There was nothing to follow around anymore.
But as the days and weeks go on and the initial shock wears off, bigger problems arise for those closest to the singer's heart, including his widow, Deborah Coons. She and Jerry have only been married for a year and a half.
Deborah's a very refined, sort of a private school girl type, trust fund, East Coast, not a hippie mama, not a earth mother, not a funky, fun gal.
Jerry's unexpected death makes Deborah the co-executor of the estate, and it's a mess.
Jerry did not have high priority in doing estate planning. He had many other interests, his music, his art, personal matters. I had drafted several wills for him over time, and as different events occurred in his life, we tried to get him to do new wills or do new estate planning as best we could.
Under Hellman's counsel, Jerry Garcia writes his final will. But what Garcia's will does not take into account is the host of other financial arrangements the king of generosity made with ex-lovers, friends, and even former employees.
Well, when someone dies of some fame or notoriety, you do tend to get a lot of unusual type of claims, and some of them totally inappropriate, and they all have to be looked at with seriousness and attempt to see whether or not there is any validity to them, and then move forward and take the legal course to resolve the issues.
I don't think Jerry personally gave a damn about money. There are famous stories of car repair guys, working on his car and finding checks and cash stuffed under seats and in the glove box and stuff like that. Jerry really just wanted to play music, and he wanted to do his art, and I don't think he cared about money. He liked, being able to take care of people.
Garcia's generosity may have stemmed from the fact that his father wasn't around for long when he grew up. August 1st, 1942. Jerome John Garcia, named for composer Jerome Kern, is born to loving parents Ruth Marie and Joe Ramon. When Jerry is 3, his brother, Tiff, chops off one of Jerry's fingers in a woodcutting accident. Garcia loses the middle finger on his right hand. Less than a year later, another tragic accident strikes the family. Garcia's beloved father drowns.
Jerry was raised by his grandmother. His mother was an emergency room nurse and owned a bar, a working man's bar near the foot of the Bay Bridge. She was not a real active parent. The grandmother raised Jerry and his brother Cliff as latchkey kids out in the Excelsior, which is sort of a, on the edge of San Francisco, working class neighborhood.
And it's while living with Grandma that Garcia's own love for music really begins.
He told of having taught himself how to play the guitar and not even knowing how to tune it at first. But he immediately launched into, Chuck Berry and all the stuff that was happening in those days.
In his late teens, Garcia ventures into more new sounds and styles.
After he got out of the Army, he was living down on the peninsula and started hanging out with these guys that were more interested in folk music. He was hanging out in the sort of intellectual scene in Palo Alto near Stanford University, where the coffee houses and Kepler's bookstore and things were.
At Kepler's bookstore in 1963, a 21-year-old Jerry Garcia meets Sarah Rupenthal. Not long after they meet, Rupenthal and Garcia get married and have a daughter together.
I don't know how to describe Jerry Garcia and relationships with women, except to say that he fell in love often, that he really didn't want to be tied down into long-term marriages, and he tended to stray. So his marriage to Sarah Rupenthal was not a long marriage.
Garcia's world is turned upside down when both LSD and Bob Weir enter his life.
Bob Weir was the teenage Hollywood star of the band. He was about 19 years old, and he was gorgeous and had a good voice. And of course, he played bluegrass and folk music. And that was the nucleus that would become the Grateful Dead.
They began by playing in pizza parlors and bars and the kind of stuff that every American band basically started out doing. But they started getting weird in a hurry because that's the kind of people they were. And then when LSD entered the picture, it sort of blew the doors off the entire thing.
There was a need of drug culture with the Grateful Dead. Jerry's on record as commenting on how important LSD was in his life, how it opened his eyes, the doors of perception, I guess. LSD opened his eyes and showed him a world that he didn't realize existed.
Pretty soon they had a whole little scene going up in the hills of La Honda. Decided that they wanted to hold public events where people would take LSD and groove, and there would be spontaneous happenings. These were called the acid test, and they needed a band.
Garcia and his band joined the acid test party.
The acid test was a sort of participatory event. Everybody who came to the acid test paid $1 to get in. There was no performer versus audience thing. Everybody was part of the happening. You'd come in costume. Everybody created the event together. The Grateful Dead were there as sort of the house band. They would just play and listen to each other and create musical paths together because they were all high and they were all incredibly open-minded, and they were in this situation that gave them unlimited license to play or not play.
When you have one genius musician in a band, the gravity just tilts toward that person. And Jerry was somebody whose musical abilities and whose artistic reach was just beyond ordinary people.
One of the musicians was a blues player, a harmonica player, Pigpen. Let's see, we had Bob Weir, who loved classical music and rock and roll. We had Phil Lesh, who was a classically trained musician, and also big band and jazz. So we had this amazing amalgam then of American music. That's what's Grateful Dead music, blends it all together.
The Grateful Dead are on their way to major national success, selling millions of records. But the rock and roll lifestyle is taking its toll on Jerry as he plays more than 80 shows a year.
That 3-show run at Cal Expo in 1994 was just frightening. He looked very near death at that time.
Jerry Garcia, frontman for the Grateful Dead, dies, leaving behind friends, family, devastated fans, and several former lovers who would soon be embroiled in the mother of all legal battles over his estate. But in 1964, they are just beginning their unconventional rise to greatness. The Grateful Dead are not like any other band. Their success stems from a steady growth of followers, not album sales.
The Grateful Dead in San Francisco drew a crowd unlike any other band. They'd show up at Winterland on public transportation, get off the bus and crowd in the place. They smelled like hell, they dressed like crazy bastards, and they danced all night long. The band itself was indistinguishable from the audience. They were very much a part of the same culture that the people who went to their shows were. And the same people would come night after night. The band never played the same show. It wasn't like a show business thing. They'd get up on stage and start where they wanted to start, and they'd go where they wanted to go, and they'd finish when they wanted to finish.
And the Grateful Dead becomes known as the band that never plays the same show twice. The ticket-buying followers are known as Deadheads. Wherever the band went, their Deadheads went with them to hear the music that was all their own.
A Deadhead is someone who is passionate about Grateful Dead music, who listens to their music, who hopefully, although they can't see them anymore, chances are a real Deadhead is somebody who saw the Grateful Dead performing up until 1995 when they stopped performing. Their business model of touring and selling tickets rather than selling vinyl and records and recordings is also part of their musical legacy. It was this interaction between the audience and the band, which just didn't capture on vinyl, and as a result, not being captured on vinyl, it didn't broadcast well over the radio either.
In the mid-60s, as the Grateful Dead are getting bigger, Jerry meets his second wife, Carolyn Adams, a member of the Merry Pranksters, a group formed around author Ken Kesey, living communally and experimenting with psychedelic drugs. Adams was known to her friends as Mountain Girl.
Mountain Girl was so beautiful, such a gorgeous young lady, and she lived in a house up the hill from Kesey and the Merry Pranksters of La Honda, which was how she got the nickname Mountain Girl.
At the time, she had a child from Ken Kesey called Sunshine. And they were both married when they met, yet they started shacking up together, as you'd call it in the 60s.
Although Adams is still married at the time, she moves into the same house where Garcia is living in the hippie Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco.
She was kind of the mother figure for the whole Grateful Dead scene early on. She kind of took care of everybody. They all lived communally early in their career in the very early 60s in San Francisco. And she was the den mother, so to speak. I think that's the title that they bestowed on her. So she was an amazing gal.
But even in the early days, the band's success depends on Jerry being away for long stretches. Jerry and Mountain Girl spend the late 60s and early 70s together, although their relationship is less than conventional.
Jerry and Mountain Girl did not live together like husband and wife day in, day out for 30 years. He had a tendency to stray and have relationships with other women, and this is something that Mountain Girl unfortunately knew all too well.
By the 70s, the Grateful Dead have reached national fame.
And over time, as the Grateful Dead legend grew and the Grateful Dead's audience grew and the Grateful Dead's economic and cultural presence grew, he wound up being the center of it and the focus of a huge and ultimately, I think, really burdensome kind of universe. And it took a tremendous toll on him.
For Garcia, touring leads to other women and more drugs.
In the late 70s, the drugs changed, and it was a change for the worse. More people, I think, in and around the band and in the audience were taking cocaine. And so it kind of just began to kind of fall apart.
As the 70s turn into the 80s, the singer's health and drug use go from bad to worse.
Mountain Girl, she didn't have a problem with psychedelics and pot and, soft drugs. But she was alarmed by the narcotics. And I don't think she knew what to do with an addicted husband and father of her children.
But in 1981, despite their history of ups and downs, 20 years and 2 daughters together, Jerry and Mountain Girl decide to marry backstage at a Grateful Dead concert.
Over the years, Jerry and Mountain Girl's relationship changed a lot, especially after there were children. And I think he found the duties of being a father and house husband to be somewhat beyond him. He was interested in playing music. He was interested in getting high.
Jerry's health really started to degrade, I think, around that time. And I remember in 1983 and 1984, you listen to the tapes and you can just hear people chewing their teeth in the band. The music is fast and it lurches from one thing to another. It had lost a tremendous amount of its grace and it had lost a tremendous amount of its patience.
In 1986, at the age of 43, Garcia collapses and ends up in a diabetic coma for 5 days. While the Grateful Dead cancel their fall tour following Garcia's collapse, as soon as the dedicated frontman feels ready, he decides the show must go on. And despite his precarious condition, the rocker does not change his lifestyle.
I believe Jerry felt obligated to continue to tour. He was the de facto leader after all of the Grateful Dead. Even though he didn't care to have that title, he was in fact the leader. He had this magical, amazing, charismatic personality that just attracted people to him. That's why we followed them around. That's why the musicians stuck with him for 30 years, the same band members for 30 years.
There was a huge amount of pressure on Jerry. He was the center of an immense universe, and there was a huge amount of money coming in. They were grossing like $50 million a year between their concerts and their merchandise and all this other stuff. And I think that the people in the band and the people around him had just profoundly mixed feelings because I think that they knew it was killing him. I think they knew he was tired of it, but it was really, really hard to say no.
In 1993, Garcia and Adams agree to divorce. Just a few months later, Garcia marries his third wife, Deborah Coons, a woman he had known 2 decades earlier.
At the time Jerry did marry Deborah, there was a good celebration. The family was all there, and it was a happy time. Everybody seemed to be getting along quite well.
But despite his new marriage, the singer's drug use does not slow down.
That 3-show run at Cal Expo in 1994 was just frightening. He looked very near death at that time. And it was painful to watch him, and the music was really, really suffering from it. And you could see all of the other guys in the band putting out extra energy. They were going to hold this thing up one way or another and be there for him. If he chose to play, if he showed up ready to engage, they wanted to be there for him.
On August 8th, Garcia checks into Serenity Knolls Drug Rehabilitation Center. He dies the next day.
When Jerry died, it was not a surprise, and I had been grieving his loss for quite some time already.
As deadheads are grieving Jerry's death, even the funeral becomes a battlefield.
Once Jerry died, just everything went crazy.
We might want to talk about the burial, because that was all nutty.
Rock and roll icon Jerry Garcia dies, leaving behind a multi-million-dollar estate, not to mention a host of monetary promises. Promises that send those that the Grateful Dead's frontman loved most into raging battle. Garcia's loved ones struggle to make sense of all he leaves behind. Garcia's widow, Deborah Coons, bears the brunt of it.
Well, Jerry Garcia's will really wasn't the problem. In fact, if there's one document that was fairly well prepared and actually witnessed and notarized, it was his will. The problem was everything else. It's fine to have all of these relationships, but his intentions with respect to providing for them was less than clear. The distribution of assets and the role of the executor was very much in dispute.
Once Jerry died, everything went crazy. The linchpin had been pulled out of the Grateful Dead, and it just spun out of control. Nobody knew what to do. There was nobody to talk to that would have the grounded information. There was nobody who was going to be able to pull all these disparate elements together.
When someone dies, one of the harbingers of things to come is how the funeral went. Sometimes people argue over the words in the obituary, where the funeral service is going to be held. Should the person be buried in a casket or should they be cremated? Jerry Garcia's estate, unfortunately, was no different.
Jerry Garcia is laid to rest in a private funeral at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Belvedere, California, in a ceremony that many would say proceeds beautifully. That is, those who are permitted to attend.
The memorial service, funeral service for him was closely controlled. It had been kept a secret as to where the location was, and at the door there were people that kept you out or let you in depending upon who you were. And Deborah had, as Jerry's wife, had decided that she did not want Carolyn Adams to be there.
Ex-wife Mountain Girl was kept off of the guest list.
Deborah Coons has been very jealous of her position in Jerry's life. Mountain Girl was the recognized wife. Mountain Girl was the mother of the daughters. Mountain Girl was the one that everybody knew. Mountain Girl was the one he was living with when Deborah met Jerry.
Widow Deborah Coons also prevents Adams from boarding the boat that will spread Garcia's ashes in San Francisco Bay.
So the harbinger of things to come emerged by virtue of Deborah Coons saying, no, you can't board the boat. You can't be part of the process of spreading Jerry's ashes. Once that happens, the gloves come off.
I'm not leaving until I see her, okay?
Mountain Girl stood on the dock yelling at the top of her voice. Remember I said she was no shrinking violet. This is family. Those are my daughters. This is family.
It's my family!
Mountain Girl is one of the most solid characters I've ever known.
They had 2 children, and she was a meaningful part of his life for many, many years. Perhaps the longest relationship that Jerry Garcia had with a woman that he loved was, in fact, with Mountain Girl.
Jerry cared for her a lot. That's why he married her towards the end of his career, was so that he made sure that she was taken care of financially. That's my understanding.
When they separate in 1993, together they write a divorce agreement without the use of lawyers, in which Jerry agrees to pay Adams $5 million over a period of several years.
At the time that Jerry and Carolyn Adams reached their agreement, they came out of the conference room, told me what it was, and I did comment that I thought that was an awful lot of money for Jerry to agree to be paying to her. But that is something that Jerry felt was appropriate, and so that was the way it stood.
When Garcia dies, however, payments to Carolyn Adams cease unexpectedly.
Deborah Coons felt that that was not an appropriate agreement, that it was way too much, and one of the issues that Deborah Coons did raise was Jerry's mental state at that point in time, and whether or not he had known really what he was doing or had capacity really to come into that agreement.
I do think that her reason for contesting the agreement and setting aside the agreement was based more on personal animosity and her conflicted position as it was whether or not the agreement was really binding. Deborah Coons not only was co-executrix of Jerry Garcia's estate, she was also a beneficiary. Her interest is what's called a remainder interest. That is, after the payment of debts and expenses, support payments, she was to participate in the residuary of his estate equal to 1/3. So clearly, the larger the estate, the more her interest would increase.
On October 17, 1995, 2 months after Garcia's death, Mountain Girl sues the estate for the rest of her money.
Mountain Girl was put in an odd position because Deborah Coons, in seeking to set aside the note, included in her submissions an allegation that the marriage was a tax sham, that it wasn't a real marriage. So it put Mountain Girl in the position of trying to disprove that by showing that it was a real marriage, and part of that was her showing love letters.
In her very public courtroom battle against Garcia's widow, Adams reads a letter she claims Garcia wrote in the 1980s. The letter is meant to prove Jerry's lasting love for Adams, contrary to Coons' claim that Garcia's love for Adams was short-lived, and he only married Adams for tax benefits.
The court case was a calamity in the Grateful Dead world. These people had spent their lives keeping their mouths shut, keeping their soiled linen private, and not speaking in public ill of any member. It was an important part of the code of the Grateful Dead. And here's Deborah causing all this trouble and creating this law case rather than just writing the check, which would have been the Grateful Dead way.
But the letter is not exactly what it seems. To the surprise of the courtroom, Coons' lawyers established through an offhand reference made in the text that the letter was written before 1976 and not in the 1980s when Adams says she received it. This does not make it a win for Coons, however.
Mountain Girl was excluded, and it was not received well by the Dead community. And this demonstrated this divisiveness, if you will, this exclusivity that seemed counter to the whole Grateful Dead scene.
Ultimately, the court determines Garcia and Adams did have a long-lasting, loving relationship.
We considered Mountain Girl to be one of our own in the Grateful Dead scene. She was. I mean, she was there at the very beginning, and she continued to be a member of the scene and continued to influence it, and she had Jerry's kids after all.
Deborah Coons was such a brief episode in Jerry's life. They were married very shortly after he ran into her a second time, much later in life, and she was married to him for a year and change when he died. That's no time at all in the Grateful Dead world. There were people that had worked with Jerry for 35 years that she didn't know their names and they didn't know who she was.
In 1998, Carolyn Adams settles for a lump sum of $1.25 million, and the court officially recognizes her as being a legitimate wife of Jerry Garcia. But the battles are not over. In the months to follow, even more claimants crawl out of the woodwork. For Coons, suddenly it seems as though the celebrated musician struck deals with far more than just his ex-wife and significant others. Former employees, acquaintances, and friends also come forward to claim their share of the pot. On September 2, 1998, longtime office manager for the Grateful Dead, Suzanne Stevens, files a claim against the estate. Stevens argued she helped secure the royalties to the Ben & Jerry's ice cream flavor in Garcia's name, Jerry Garcia, and for her efforts, Garcia made her a promise. If her position working for the Grateful Dead was ever terminated, she would be compensated by a percentage of the ice cream royalties.
Suzanne Stevens had noticed that Ben & Jerry's ice cream had a flavor called Cherry Garcia. So she claims that she spoke to Jerry Garcia about it, and he authorized her to reach out to the folks at Ben & Jerry's and say to them there should be an agreement with Jerry Garcia where he's to get a percentage of sales.
Annual royalties for the ice cream flavor come steadily in around $400,000. According to Ben & Jerry's, Garcia did give them his permission to use his name, the frontman's legendary reply being, "As long as they don't name a motor oil after me." But the ice cream company never entered into a formal licensing agreement with Garcia for the use of his name.
It was their #1 seller, so they did indeed reach an agreement that Jerry Garcia would be paid a percentage of the ice cream sales.
For Stevens, who was part of the Grateful Dead organization for many years, the deal she had with Garcia was meant to be a kind of severance agreement.
Both the executors were very surprised when Suzanne Stevens raised this issue about the claim for half of the royalties on Ben & Jerry's. It had never been brought up before. It did come out of nowhere, and that was a good part of the reason why we rejected it. There was no substantiation at all for that claim.
When the case is finally settled, Suzanne Stevens accepts an undisclosed amount for her part in securing rights to Cherry Garcia ice cream. But the claims don't stop there.
There was one lady who claimed she was owed millions of dollars and she'd actually been married to Jerry. Unfortunately, none of that was true, and she did have some mental problems.
But a more credible claim comes as one of Garcia's former partners arrives on the scene with her own bone to pick with the estate.
He and Manasha had been negotiating a formal trust agreement to hold the house.
No lawyers, no accountants. This was just an oral agreement, but Jerry lived by it.
Free spirit and Grateful Dead legend Jerry Garcia dies, leaving behind an assortment of IOUs to ex-lovers and partners. Free love has ended up costing Garcia a lot.
When Jerry Garcia performed at his concerts, one of the things that he liked doing was looking at the audience and feeling energy. And he thought if he felt someone who had good energy, he could lock into that person during the concert to help alleviate his nerves. One of the people that he locked in on their vibe was Manasha Matherson, who was a real Deadhead. She did follow the Grateful Dead band around.
Matheson, a college graduate and holistic healer, first meets Garcia in 1978 at a Grateful Dead concert.
She did something interesting during one of the shows, was she cut off her long, beautiful hair during the concert, which certainly caught Jerry's eye.
The two don't develop a relationship immediately, but they decide to keep in touch, hoping to eventually get together. That time comes under unexpected conditions.
When Jerry went into the coma in 1986, there was an outpouring of support from the whole Deadhead community. We loved Jerry. We would have done anything for him. There were offers of kidneys and livers, whatever it took to restore him to health. We're passionate. We wanted to go on forever.
Almost a decade after their first encounter, Garcia asks Matheson to help him recover.
Now, Manasha is the Earth Mother. She's like, a hippie stereotype out of an R. Crumb comic, and a good-hearted gal.
In 1987, the two fall in love and move in together, even though Garcia is still married to Mountain Girl. Daughter Keelan Noel Garcia is born that December.
Manasha and Jerry Garcia loved each other. They decided to have a child. And when they did have that child, Keelan, they were living together as husband and wife. Jerry Garcia changed diapers and held the baby and really bonded with Keelan.
Garcia and Matheson even talk of getting married. But the wedding never happens. For one, Garcia's divorce has not yet been finalized. And two, there is another woman on the horizon. And Jerry is ready to move on.
When Jerry's relationship stopped with somebody, if it was at least a personal relationship, then he felt that it was appropriate that as best as possible things went smoothly and amicably, and that people were well received and taken care of as best as could be done.
Jerry leaves, but still true to his generous and peacekeeping spirit, he sets up a financial agreement with Manasha and Keelan.
He and Manasha had been negotiating a formal trust agreement to hold the house for Keelan's benefit, and that never got concluded prior to his death. Deborah Coons felt that the amount of support needed to be appropriate, as well as I felt the same way. We got analysis based on a budget of what Manasha needed in terms of monthly money, and the court approved that as a reasonable amount of money, and we moved forward from there.
Coons reduces the payments.
Deborah Coons and the co-executors took the position that those payments were not in writing, that there was no court order to make such payments, and the payments were drastically reduced. Manasha Matheson took the position ultimately that she said, I've taken an 85% pay cut in the amount of wealth that I'm now getting from the estate, and I'm financially in bad shape. She had to borrow money from friends and relatives, and she was living hand to mouth. Now, you could say, well, she should have had an agreement. Perhaps that's true, but it goes back to the way Jerry was: peace, love, spontaneity, lack of rigidity, and not using lawyers and accountants. And in this case, it turned out to hurt him and Manasha and Keelan.
With two claims from former partners already pending, the battle for Garcia's estate is only about to get worse. When the real person behind him leaving Matheson comes forward for her piece of the pie, her name is Barbara Meyer.
Barbara Meyer had been a former girlfriend of Jerry's, and they had had a serious relationship.
It's California, 1960s. Jerry Garcia meets Barbara Meyer in Menlo Park while the two are students.
Barbara Meyer, who apparently was a high school sweetheart of his, she was into poetry. Jerry was a big fan of her poetry. He thought she was beautiful and had a good spirit.
Soon, Barbara and Jerry become inseparable. Meyer also supports Garcia financially in these early days as an aspiring musician. She buys him his first 12-string guitar. But their relationship doesn't last, and by 1962, the two have split. In the 1990s, the unexpected happens and the old lovers meet again after a friend gives Garcia a copy of Meyer's latest book of poetry. Despite the fact Jerry is still technically with Manasha Matheson and isn't even divorced from Mountain Girl, The old lovers decide to vacation in Hawaii together, and it looks to everyone like Jerry's health has returned.
Though they were separated or didn't see each other for many years, later on in life, in fact, shortly before he married Deborah Coons, he was going to marry Barbara Meyer, and they were actually planning a wedding.
But Garcia's drug use is too much for Barbara.
He was a heroin addict. He had, in the past, lapsed into a diabetes coma for 5 days. He was overeating. He was smoking cigarettes. And he had signs of illness that he was treating with acupuncture because he really didn't want to go to hospitals.
When Meyer confronts Garcia about his drug use, the rocker ends the relationship.
As part of their quote-unquote breakup, apparently she pointed out to him that there were certain financial needs and obligations that she had. When Jerry asked her how much, she said around $59,000, and he said, fine, I'll double it, $108,000.
Although he ends the relationship, he arranges for Barbara to have financial compensation for the sacrifices she made to be with him, a total of $108,000. But just as they did for Mountain Girl, Meyer's payments stop suddenly once Garcia is gone, and Deborah Coons doesn't stop there.
Around the Grateful Dead circles, they call Deborah the Black Widow.
The Grateful Dead production said, wait a minute, those aren't Jerry's guitars to begin with. Those are the band's guitars.
Jerry Garcia dies, leaving behind an estate estimated at $18 million. But as it goes to probate, millions of dollars in claims surface against what the free-loving rock icon leaves behind. One of his lovers, Barbara Meyer, is battling with the estate for compensation she says Jerry promised to her.
The claim by Barbara Myers did not have any prior written agreement. There were documents going back and forth and discussions, but nothing had been formalized at that point before he died.
There was only $21,000 left on that obligation when he died, but the estate stopped making them. And Coons took the position that there was no legally enforceable document, and therefore she wasn't, as co-executrix, going to make the payments, and she didn't. So Barbara Meyer sued. Now, here it is again, no lawyers, no accountants, hippie culture, revolution that they were part of. This was just an oral agreement, but Jerry lived by it. And he had made his payments, and there's only $21,000 due. So Barbara Meyer was just one person whose payments stopped right after Jerry died.
Deborah was outside of that culture, that Grateful Dead culture. She had showed up very recently, and she didn't understand the rules, and she wasn't going to play the game. So this is some kind of blood feud on the part of Deborah Coons. Around the Grateful Dead circles, they call Deborah the Black Widow.
Deadheads blame Deborah Coons for tarnishing Garcia's free-loving, free-living legacy.
If Jerry were watching Beyond the Grave, he'd be laughing and laughing and laughing. Money didn't matter. The music mattered. The brotherhood mattered. The love mattered. Those were the things that counted to Jerry Garcia.
I'm sure she's a good person. I'm sure she tried to do the right thing by the estate. But when you have someone who's so conflicted, so emotionally charged as wife number 3, seeking to enforce a will that provides for children from prior marriages, ex-wife number 2, payments due to prior girlfriends, there's just too much animosity, there's too much angst, there's too much in the way of mental anguish to expect that one can act without emotion.
Finally, after years of litigation, ex-partner Manasha Matheson comes to a private settlement with the court. And Barbara Meyer is paid the remaining $21,000 she is owed under her agreement with Garcia. But still, the fighting continues. The band itself ends up heading into a sticky courtroom battle with guitar maker Douglas Irwin over a specification in Garcia's will.
Jerry Garcia, in his will, left his guitars to their maker, Douglas Irwin. And these guitars had names. For example, Rosebud, the Tiger.
The guitars were very special. Jerry didn't own a lot of guitars. You know, a guy like Steve Miller has 700 guitars. Jerry had one guitar that he played and one guitar in case that guitar got broken.
The guitars, all named, are considered by the band members and fans as part of the Grateful Dead family.
It seemed to be a nice token, you know, for someone to say, I give you this guitar, or I give you this ring. It's nice because it's something that you could really remember the person by. And to Douglas Irwin, I'm sure Jerry thought he would really appreciate getting the guitars back that he made.
The dispute based upon who really owned the guitars. Jerry could, under his will, only give away what he owned at the time he died.
Both the band members and Irwin feel they have the best claim to the guitars.
What was supposed to be a nice gesture wound up to be litigation for years. Why? Number one, because the Grateful Dead production said, wait a minute, those aren't Jerry's guitars to begin with. Those are the band's guitars. The band paid for these guitars. So Jerry had no right to bequeath them to someone else.
While guitar maker Douglas Irwin receives two of his guitars, the Tiger and the Wolf, Irwin sells the guitars at an auction for $1.74 million.
It was a slam dunk case. The band lost. Irwin was given the guitars. He sold them both at auction. Both of them brought more than $1 million. The owner of the Indiana Colts bought one of them. He keeps it in his basement and, you know, plays on Wednesday afternoons with his buddies with Jerry's guitar. I mean,
A lot of people felt that they should have been put into a museum or the Music Hall of Fame or kept by the Grateful Dead or somebody because they did have some historical value in relation to Jerry and the Grateful Dead. But the will provided otherwise, and that was Jerry's intent.
This was another example at the end there where things hadn't been planned out very well in my mind and led to this disappointment, I would say, in the Deadhead community. Let's stop the fighting. That's just not who we are. And we thought that the organization wasn't like that either.
In the end, more than $1 million have been spent on legal fees. According to Hellman, eventually the claims were all resolved.
The executors for Jerry tried in every instance to settle every matter one way or another, and by settlement doesn't mean that much was paid, if anything was paid, but just that a resolution was reached with the person filing the creditor's claim.
If Deborah Coons, as co-executor, had honored the equitable distribution agreements, she could have probably reduced the legal fee significantly and saved the estate money. But more importantly, she probably could have continued what Jerry would have wanted, I think, is in the spirit of kindness and cooperation and trying to help people. The administration of his estate could have been less litigious.
Was, in the long run, after Jerry died, was everything settled and peaceful and people satisfied? No. Nobody was satisfied. The band has never been satisfied. Everybody has been at each other's throats. All the women, all the workers, all the people that were loyal to this group for so many years, nobody got what they wanted.
But for Deadheads, the music and the scene around the Grateful Dead are much stronger memories than the court battles ever will be. Jerry Garcia will be remembered as the face behind the band who got people dancing, the teddy bear who painted the sky in psychedelic light.
When all is said and done, the other musicians in the band related to each other more through Jerry than to one another. You know, he just was that sort of guy. He had the best ideas and had the quickest mind, and he was surrounded by other very, very smart people, but he just was the natural center of that world.
To me, Jerry Garcia represented the 60s. At least a revolution of young people who believed in kindness and peace and generosity, attending concerts like Woodstock, protesting the Vietnam War, experimenting with drugs, experimenting with sex, experimenting with music. He was, perhaps not intending to be, but became symbolic of that era.
The Grateful Dead were one of the few rock bands that actually stood for something. They approached their life and their work with a set of principles, and as long as Jerry was alive, they adhered to those principles. As a result, they were able to do things that other rock bands would never have been able to do. And they achieved a relationship with an audience that is unparalleled by other rock bands.
I lost a lifestyle when the Grateful Dead stopped touring, absolutely. I lost this iconic figure, this magnetic, charismatic, wonderful leader of the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia. Once a Deadhead, always a Deadhead. Yeah, I think that's probably true. It's certainly true for me. I'm just as passionate today as I ever was.
Thank you.